She didn't scream when she opened her eyes and found him standing over her. She just lifted her chin, met his cold gaze without flinching, and said, "I followed your dog, sir. Nothing more." Outside that door, 59 women were still waiting for this man to choose one of them. Not one of them had ever dared look him in the eye the way she just had. And none of them had ever made him forget, even for a moment, that he was supposed to choose. If this story moves you, subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this tale has traveled. The dog found her first. That was the part no one ever believed when Elizabeth Carter tried to explain it afterward. Not her mother, not the women who whispered about her in church, not the magistrate who later held her reputation in his hands, like a playing card he hadn't decided whether to keep or discard. Nobody believed a story that started with a dog. But it did. It started exactly there, with a hunting hound the color of charcoal and river mud limping through the garden hedges of Hawthorne Hall, with a thorn the size of a man's thumb lodged deep in his left forepaw. Whimpering so softly that no one else at the party even heard him, Elizabeth heard him. She always heard things other people didn't bother to. It was the summer of 1816, and the evening had turned cruel in the way only Virginia summers could, the kind of heat that pressed against your skin even after the sun went down, that made the air inside a crowded ballroom feel like the inside of a bread oven. Elizabeth had been standing near the east garden door for the better part of an hour, holding a glass of lemonade she hadn't touched, watching the daughters of wealthy men circle Nathaniel Hawthorne like planets around a sun they hadn't earned and couldn't name. There were 59 of them. She had counted. Not out of bitterness, she wasn't the bitter sort, but out of the particular kind of boredom that comes from being dragged somewhere you don't belong by a mother who believes proximity to wealth is the same thing as access to it. You stand straighter when you think someone's watching. Her mother had told her that afternoon, pulling the laces of Elizabeth's best dress tight enough to make breathing a project. "Tonight, you will be watched." "I don't want to be watched, Mama." "What you want," her mother had said with the precision of a woman who had been disappointed by life exactly as many times as she expected, "has nothing to do with tonight." So Elizabeth had come. She had worn the dress. She had stood near the refreshment table and watched 59 women compete for a man who hadn't smiled once in the 2 hours she'd been observing him. And she had thought quietly, privately, in the part of her mind she kept locked against her mother's voice, that every single one of them deserved better than a man who looked at people the way Nathaniel Hawthorne looked at people. Like they were acreage he was deciding whether to purchase. Then she heard the dog. The whimper came from the gap between two hedges, low and rhythmic and patient, the way animals cry when they've given up expecting anyone to come. Elizabeth set her lemonade on the nearest flat surface, slipped through the garden door before anyone could stop her, and crouched down in the dark between the rose bushes until her eyes adjusted and she found him. He was enormous, probably the largest hunting hound she had ever seen, and he was trying very hard not to show how much pain he was in. His dark eyes found her face and held there, and he didn't growl, didn't flinch away. He just looked at her with an expression that Elizabeth recognized immediately as the canine equivalent of "please." "All right," she said softly. "All right, I see it. Hold still." She had to tear a strip from her petticoat to do it properly. The thorn came out in one careful pull, and the dog exhaled. Actually exhaled a long, shuddering breath, and then did something that surprised her. He stood up, tested his weight on the paw, shook himself once, and started walking. Not toward the party, not toward the lights. Toward the east wing of the main house, along a path worn into the grass that suggested it had been walked by this particular animal many hundreds of times. "No," Elizabeth said. No. You go back to wherever you came from. I have to go back inside before my mother notices I've torn my dress." The dog stopped, looked back at her, and whimpered again. Once. It was a different kind of whimper than before, not pain. Something else. Like he was asking a question. She followed him. She would never in all the years that came after be able to explain why. except that the alternative was going back inside and watching 59 women smile at a man who didn't smile back. And sometimes a whimpering dog in the dark is simply a more honest place to be. The east wing was quiet. The windows were dark. A single door stood partially open at the end of a short corridor, and the dog pushed through it without hesitation, moving directly to a large chair near the window and turning 3 times before settling onto it with the particular satisfaction of an animal who has found his rightful place. Elizabeth stood in the doorway and looked around the room. It was a man's room. That was clear before her eyes had fully adjusted the smell of leather and wood smoke and something sharper underneath gunpowder maybe, or the kind of boot polish that came in metal tins. A writing desk stood against one wall, covered in papers and correspondence that looked like it hadn't been touched in weeks. A military coat hung from a hook near the door, its brass buttons dull, its shoulder bearing a tear that had been mended with careful, unpracticed stitching. The stitching of a man who had done it himself, because asking for help wasn't something he did. She should have left. She knew she should have left. She stood in the doorway for 10 full seconds, telling herself to turn around and walk back to the party and forget the dog and the room and the corridor. And then she took 1 step inside to check the dog's paw one more time because the light inside was better than the light outside and the floor was cooler than the hallway. And she was so very tired of standing in shoes that were half a size too small, pretending to be exactly the kind of woman she had spent 24 years refusing to become. She sat down in the chair across from the dog, just for a moment, just to rest her feet. The summer heat pressed down even here, and the room was quiet in a way the ballroom hadn't been, and the dog's breathing was slow and even, and Elizabeth Carter closed her eyes for what she told herself was 30 seconds and did not open them again until the door swung wide. She came awake the way she always did all at once, completely every sense arriving at the same moment. The dog was upright in his chair. The room was dark except for the lamplight coming from the hallway, and that lamplight was being partially blocked by the largest silhouette she had ever seen in a doorway. For one arrested second, neither of them moved. Then the man stepped inside, and the light shifted, and Elizabeth saw his face for the first time without the intervening distance of a ballroom. Nathaniel Hawthorne was not what she had expected. From across the party, she had catalogued him the way she catalogued everything efficiently without sentiment, and she had noted the height, the width of his shoulders, the way he stood slightly apart from his own guests, as though the gathering were happening at his house, but not entirely for him. She had noted the jaw, which was the kind of jaw that suggested its owner had made a habit of setting it against things and winning. She had noted the coldness. She had not noted his eyes. At this distance she could see them clearly, and they were not cold at all. They were something else. Tired maybe, or careful. The eyes of a man who had learned that what he let himself feel had consequences, and had been managing those consequences for so long that the management had become indistinguishable from the man. Those eyes found her, and stayed. The silence lasted exactly long enough to become something they would both remember. "Miss," he said at last. His voice was lower than she'd expected measured, the kind of voice that didn't raise itself. "I believe you're in my room." Elizabeth stood up. She did it carefully because her feet were still half asleep, and because her dress was wrinkled, and she had a strand of hair falling across her face that she could feel but couldn't fix without making a production of it, and she refused to make a production of anything in front of this particular man. "I am aware of that, sir," she said. "I apologize. I came in to help your dog." The large hound chose this moment to thump his tail against the chair cushion twice, as if confirming her account. Something shifted in Nathaniel Hawthorne's expression. It wasn't quite softening. It was more like a slight recalculation, the kind that happens when a situation refuses to be what you assumed it was going to be. "Caesar," he said. The dog thumped his tail again. "He had a thorn in his forepaw," Elizabeth said. "He was limping in the garden. I removed it." She paused. "He led me here. I sat down and fell asleep. I recognize how that sounds, and I'm sorry for the intrusion. I'll leave immediately." She moved toward the door. "Your petticoat is torn," he said. She stopped. "Yes. You tore it to remove the thorn." It was the most practical material available. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. Outside, distantly, the music from the ballroom continued its cheerful, uninformed work. "How long?" he said. "Have you been in my room?" "I don't know precisely. Perhaps an hour. I didn't intend to fall asleep." She paused. "I had been standing in ill-fitting shoes for 2 hours prior, which I offer not as an excuse but as context." Something moved across his face that might in a less severe man have been the beginning of amusement. "Whose daughter are you?" "Carter," she said. "Thomas Carter's. We have the farm on the Culpeper Road." She watched him process this. Watched the social arithmetic happen behind his careful eyes. Carter Culpeper rode the small farm, the party invitation that had been extended as a courtesy, because Virginia society was interconnected enough that excluding the Carters entirely would have required more active effort than including them. She had been included as a courtesy. She knew it. He knew it. They both knew the other knew. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Hawthorne, I need to ask you something directly." "All right." "Did you know whose room this was before you entered it?" She looked at him steadily. "No, I followed the dog. I told you that." "You understand how this appears?" "I understand exactly how this appears." She held his gaze without wavering. "I also know what actually happened. Those are two separate things, and I don't intend to apologize for the second one simply because the first one is inconvenient." The silence that followed was a different kind than the one before. That one had been surprise. This one was something closer to consideration. Then from the hallway behind him, a woman's voice, sharp and high, and carrying the particular frequency of someone accustomed to being heard over long distances, cut through the quiet. "Nathaniel, are you there? Mrs. Prescott is asking after you, and I told her." The woman stopped speaking the moment she reached the doorway. Elizabeth watched her arrive middle-aged, dressed in the kind of expensive simplicity that announces wealth more effectively than ornamentation, with the kind of face that had once been beautiful and had now translated itself into something more durable and more formidable. Margaret Hawthorne, his mother. Elizabeth had seen her from across the party as well, moving through the room with the efficiency of a general reviewing her field. Margaret Hawthorne's eyes moved from her son to Elizabeth Carter, to the torn petticoat, to the sleeping position of the chair, to the lamp, and in approximately 3 seconds she had assembled the entire picture. Not the true picture, but the picture that existed for anyone who didn't already know the truth. "Nathaniel," she said very quietly. "Who is this?" "It's not what it appears," Elizabeth began. "I was speaking," Margaret Hawthorne said, "to my son." Elizabeth closed her mouth. "Her name is Carter," Nathaniel said. "She came in to tend Caesar's paw. She fell asleep." "In your room." "In my room." The silence that came next had edges on it. "The party," Margaret said carefully, "is still ongoing. Mrs. Prescott has 3 daughters on that floor. The Alderton family has 2. Reverend Whitmore is in attendance, and there are currently 2 housemaids and a footman within earshot of this corridor." She paused. "Is any of what I have just said unclear?" "No, ma'am," Nathaniel said. "Then I trust," his mother said, "that you understand the situation we are in." Sure. Elizabeth understood the situation they were in. She understood it with absolute clarity on the walk back through the east corridor with Margaret Hawthorne 2 steps ahead of her and Nathaniel Hawthorne 2 steps behind, arranged in the precise formation of a woman being escorted somewhere against her wishes without technically being forced. She understood it when Margaret Hawthorne guided her into a small sitting room off the main corridor and closed the door with the careful quiet of someone who very much did not want to be overheard. And she understood it when the older woman turned to face her with an expression that was not unkind precisely, but was the expression of a woman who had dealt with complicated situations before and had learned to prioritize outcomes over feelings. "Miss Carter," Margaret said, "do you understand what will happen if a single guest at this party learns that you were alone in my son's private chamber?" "Yes," Elizabeth said. "I do. Your family's reputation." "I understand the consequences, Mrs. Hawthorne. I was there when they were invented, same as you. A brief pause. You're a plain-spoken young woman. I was told that wouldn't serve me. I've found it mostly does. Margaret studied her. How old are you? 24. Are you promised to anyone? No. Does your mother know where you are? Elizabeth thought about this honestly. My mother knows I left the ballroom. She will have assumed I found a corner somewhere to avoid the dancing. She will be looking for me now, and she will be worried, and she will be trying very hard not to show it, because showing worry in front of the Prescotts and the Aldertons is not something my mother permits herself. Something shifted in Margaret's expression. Not sympathy exactly, but a kind of recognition. Then we will go and find her, she said, and we will do so before anyone else begins to look for either of you. And when we find her, Miss Carter, I would ask you to let me manage the conversation. Mrs. Hawthorne, Elizabeth said, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I won't have you manage my family. The older woman blinked. I beg your pardon. You're trying to control the narrative, which I understand. But the way you're trying to do it treats me as a piece of the problem to be managed. I am not a piece of anyone's problem. I made an error in judgment. I'll address that error myself with my own mother in my own words. She paused. After that, if you'd like to discuss how we protect everyone's reputation in a way that involves my actual participation rather than my polite silence, I'm willing to have that conversation. Margaret Hawthorne looked at her for a very long time. Well, she said at last. Ma'am? I was going to say, well, that explains a great deal about why Caesar followed you inside. She moved toward the door. Come then, Miss Carter. We'll do it your way. They found Elizabeth's mother near the refreshment table, which was exactly where Elizabeth had predicted. Sarah Carter was a small woman who had mastered the art of appearing relaxed while being entirely the opposite, and she was doing that now, holding a cup of punch she hadn't touched, and speaking to Mrs. Alderton about garden cultivation with the slightly heightened brightness of a woman whose attention was simultaneously occupied elsewhere. When she saw Elizabeth, the brightness intensified for exactly 1 second. Then it settled. There you are, Sarah said pleasantly. Mrs. Alderton, you'll excuse me. I see my daughter has found me. She crossed the room with the unhurried speed of a woman who had learned that appearing unhurried was its own form of armor. When she reached Elizabeth, she took her daughter's arm in a grip that was gentle enough to look casual and firm enough to communicate everything she wasn't going to say in public. Where were you? She said, low and even. Then she registered Margaret Hawthorne standing a half step behind Elizabeth, and her eyes sharpened. Mrs. Hawthorne, good evening. Mrs. Carter? Margaret inclined her head. I wonder if you might spare a few moments. There's a matter I'd like to discuss privately, nothing of alarm, I assure you, simply a small circumstance that arose this evening that we might navigate more comfortably in a less public setting. Sarah Carter looked at her daughter. Elizabeth met her eyes. Yes, Sarah said. Of course. The private sitting room where they ended up was small and well-appointed, and designed for exactly this kind of conversation, the kind that could not happen in earshot of 59 eligible young women and their ambitious mothers. Nathaniel was not there. Elizabeth had noticed his absence and was not certain whether it relieved her or not. She told the story herself as she had promised she would. She told it clearly and without embellishment, starting with the dog and ending with Mrs. Hawthorne finding them. She did not apologize for having followed Caesar because she wasn't sorry about that. She apologized for falling asleep because that had been a genuine failure of judgment. When she finished, the room was quiet. Her mother's face was carefully, precisely neutral. Miss Carter told me herself, Margaret said to Sarah, before I had said a word. I think that speaks to her character. I know her character, Sarah Carter said without heat. What I'd like to understand is the practical situation. The practical situation, Margaret said, is that 2 housemaids and a footman are aware that a young woman was in my son's room this evening. In my experience, that information will have reached the drawing room by morning and the village by Wednesday. Sarah's jaw tightened, just barely. And your son, she said. What does he propose? The door opened. Elizabeth did not look up immediately. She heard the footstep heavier than any of the women in the room deliberate, the footstep of a man who had walked toward difficult things for long enough that he'd stopped approaching them differently than anything else. "My son," said Nathaniel Hawthorne, "proposes that you ask him directly since he's standing here." Elizabeth looked up. He had changed from his party clothes. He was in something simpler now, darker, and it suited him better. He stood in the doorway, looking at none of them in particular, which somehow meant he was looking at all of them at once. "Nathaniel," his mother said. "I owe Miss Carter an apology," he said. "I handled the initial conversation poorly. I implied she might have come to my room deliberately, and that implication was unfair. I withdraw it." His eyes moved to Elizabeth. "I'm sorry for that." Elizabeth looked at him steadily. "Apology accepted." "Good." He looked at both mothers. "The situation is manageable if we're sensible about it. Miss Carter did nothing wrong and shouldn't be treated as though she did. If anyone in this house suggests otherwise, they'll hear from me. As for the housemaids and the footmen—" He glanced at his mother. "Handle it." "Nathaniel," Margaret said carefully, "it isn't quite that simple." "I know it isn't." He didn't look away from her. "I also know what you're going to suggest, and I'm telling you now that I won't have it discussed as though Miss Carter isn't in this room. If there's something to be said, say it in front of her." A silence. Then Margaret said with the measured precision of a woman choosing every word with purpose, "A formal arrangement. A brief engagement publicly announced to address any questions before they become accusations. It could be dissolved quietly in a month or two once the situation has settled." Elizabeth opened her mouth. "I won't do it," she said. Every head in the room turned toward her. "I understand what you're trying to do, Mrs. Hawthorne, and I understand why. But I will not enter into any arrangement, formal or informal, that treats my reputation as the problem and a false engagement as the solution." She looked at Nathaniel. "No offense intended, Mr. Hawthorne. It isn't about you specifically." "None taken," he said. And he was looking at her again with that expression she couldn't quite name, the recalculating one. The one that said he had expected something and gotten something else, and was deciding what to do with the difference. "Elizabeth," her mother said quietly. "Mama, if our name is going to be spoken poorly of, then it will be spoken poorly of. But I won't purchase safety at the cost of dishonesty, and I won't let anyone think I need saving by a last name that isn't mine." She stood up. Her feet, she noted distantly, no longer hurt. That was either courage or a very useful kind of anger, and she wasn't entirely sure which. "I think we should go home. It's late. I'll talk to whoever needs talking to in whatever way I need to talk to them, and we'll face what comes." She looked once more at Nathaniel Hawthorne. He was still watching her, still recalculating. "Good night, Mr. Hawthorne," she said. "I'm glad Caesar is all right." She walked out of the room. She kept her chin level and her steps even, and she did not look back, and she thought privately in that locked part of her mind that she had never in her life meant a departure more than that one. She was halfway down the corridor when she heard him step into the doorway behind her. "Miss Carter." She stopped, did not turn. "I meant what I said. You did nothing wrong." "I know that," she said. "I've always known that. The difficulty, Mr. Hawthorne, is that very few other people are going to." She walked on. She didn't let herself listen for his response if there was one. She walked the length of the corridor and through the garden door and out into the summer night, and the heat hit her like a second thing she'd been carrying all evening and hadn't realized until now, and she stood in the dark garden for a moment with the stars overhead and the lights of the ballroom behind her and the sound of 59 women still laughing in a room she'd never really belonged in. Caesar found her again before she reached the gate. He appeared from somewhere in the dark, limping only slightly now, and pushed his large head against her hand once. "You started this," she told him quietly. He thumped his tail. She scratched his ears anyway, because none of it was really his fault, and because some messes you walk into yourself, and some messes simply find you. And the honest thing was that tonight had been a little of both. She had a long walk home. The road was dry, and her shoes were still too small, and the night was warm, and somewhere behind her, a man she had just met was standing in his own doorway, deciding what he thought of her. She told herself she didn't care what he decided. She was wrong, and she knew she was wrong, even as she told herself, and she walked home under the Virginia stars, with that knowledge following her the whole way, quiet and persistent, like a very large dog that had decided without being asked that she was worth following. The morning after Hawthorne Hall, Elizabeth woke before sunrise, not because she wanted to, because her mind refused to stop working the way it always did when something had gone wrong, and there wasn't yet a clear path through it. She lay in the dark, listening to the familiar sounds of the Carter farmhouse settling against the night heat, and she went through the entire evening again from the beginning. The dog, the room, the torn petticoat, the two mothers, and the one man who had said, "I meant what I said, you did nothing wrong," and then let her walk away into the dark. She was not the kind of woman who replayed conversations looking for different outcomes. She was the kind of woman who replayed them looking for what she'd missed the first time. And what she had missed, she realized in the gray quiet before dawn, was the look on Margaret Hawthorne's face when Elizabeth refused the engagement. Not offense, not frustration, calculation. The woman had accepted the refusal too easily. She had nodded once and let the conversation end, and Elizabeth had taken that as a small victory. Lying in the dark now, she understood it differently. Margaret Hawthorne had not conceded. She had simply decided that the conversation in that sitting room was not the one that mattered. Elizabeth was out of bed and dressed before the birds started. Her mother was already in the kitchen. Of course she was. Sarah Carter had not slept either, and unlike her daughter, she showed it. There were shadows under her eyes and a particular set to her shoulders that Elizabeth recognized as the physical manifestation of controlled fear. "Sit down," her mother said, without turning from the stove. "Mama, sit down, Elizabeth Ann, and eat something, and then we're going to have a conversation that I should have started last night instead of letting you walk out of that room on principle." Elizabeth sat. She accepted the plate her mother set in front of her, and she ate because arguing with Sarah Carter before she'd made her point was like arguing with weather. "You were right," her mother said, sitting across from her with her own coffee, her hands wrapped around the cup. "About not accepting the engagement. I want to say that first before I say anything else. You were right." "But," Elizabeth said, "but right doesn't protect us." Her mother looked at her steadily. "By Wednesday morning, this county will know that Thomas Carter's daughter spent the night in Nathaniel Hawthorne's private chamber. The story will not be kind, and it will not be accurate, and being right about what actually happened will not matter at all." Elizabeth said nothing, because there was nothing to say. It was true. "Your father's contract with the Millbrook Mill comes up for renewal in September," her mother said. "The Millbrook family are close to the Prescotts. The Prescotts have 3 daughters who were at that party last night." Elizabeth set down her fork. "And the schoolhouse?" Her mother continued, her voice remaining, even with visible effort. "Reverend Whitmore controls the fund. He was at the party. He's a man who believes that what people think is only slightly less important than what God knows and considerably more enforceable." "Mama, I'm not asking you to feel guilty, Elizabeth. I'm asking you to understand the full picture." Sarah Carter looked at her daughter across the breakfast table, and for a moment the careful evenness of her expression slipped just slightly, and Elizabeth saw underneath it the thing her mother always kept beneath the surface. The particular exhaustion of a woman who had protected her family by anticipating every disaster and quietly redirecting it for 20 years, with almost no one noticing or thanking her for the effort. "What happens to us matters. To me, to your father, to your brother. You are not the only person in this house." "I know that," Elizabeth said quietly. "Then tell me what you intend to do." Elizabeth looked at her mother, at the cup held in both hands, at the shadows under her eyes and the set of her shoulders and all the invisible work written into both. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But I'll figure it out, and I won't let it fall on any of you." Her mother nodded once. "See that you don't." She stood, picked up her coffee, and returned to the stove, with the efficiency of a woman who had said what she came to say and now had the rest of the day to manage. And Elizabeth. Yes, when you do figure it out, don't be too proud to ask for help. It was the closest her mother had ever come to an apology. Elizabeth understood it as one, and she didn't say anything at all, which was the right response, and they both knew it.
Jaw.
The first piece of gossip reached them by noon. It came via Lucy Marsh, who was the miller's wife, and therefore the primary distribution point for information moving between the village and the outlying farms, and who appeared at the Carter gate with a basket of preserves and the particular brightness of a woman who is visiting out of concern rather than curiosity, a distinction Lucy had never quite managed to establish convincingly. "I just wanted to make sure you were well," Lucy said to Elizabeth, who had come to the gate because she'd seen her coming from the upper field. "After last night." "I'm quite well," Elizabeth said pleasantly. "Thank you for asking." "Only people are saying." Lucy paused, the way people pause when they want permission to continue saying the thing they were already going to say. "Well, people are saying you were found in the East Wing, that it was quite late. I helped Mr. Hawthorne's hunting dog," Elizabeth said. "He'd hurt his paw in the garden. I removed a thorn and stayed to make sure he was all right." Lucy's expression did several things in quick succession. The dog. Caesar. He's a charcoal gray hound, very large, quite dignified under the circumstances. "And you were alone in—" "I was alone with a dog," Elizabeth said. "Yes." Another pause. "Mrs. Prescott is saying that Nathaniel Hawthorne was seen coming out of the East Wing, very late looking." Lucy searched for the diplomatic word and settled on serious. "He returned to his own room and found a strange woman asleep in his chair," Elizabeth said. "I imagine serious is about right." Something shifted in Lucy's face, the gossip architecture struggling to accommodate a version of events that was both more and less interesting than the story she'd arrived with. Elizabeth watched it happen with the calm attention of a woman who had grown up watching her mother manage exactly these kinds of conversations. "You fell asleep," Lucy said. "I was tired," Elizabeth said. "It had been a long evening, and the chair was comfortable, and the dog was warm." She looked at Lucy steadily. "I understand how the story sounds, Lucy. I also know what happened. If you'd like to tell people the accurate version, you're welcome to. If you'd prefer the inaccurate one, I can't stop you, but I'll know which choice you made." Lucy opened her mouth, closed it, and then, to Elizabeth's quiet surprise, something honest moved across her face. "That's a hard position you're in," she said. "Yes," Elizabeth agreed. "It is. For what it's worth, and I know it isn't worth much, I believe you." "It's worth something," Elizabeth said. "Thank you." Lucy left with her preserves still in the basket, which was either a good sign or simply an oversight. Elizabeth watched her go and then stood at the gate for a moment longer, looking at the road, thinking about reach and speed, and the particular cruelty of stories that didn't need to be true to travel. She was still standing there when the horse came up the road at a canter. She recognized the horse before she recognized the rider. It was a very good horse, the kind of good that said its owner didn't think much about the cost, and it was being ridden with the efficiency of a person who knew how to ride and wasn't trying to impress anyone by doing it. When the rider pulled up at the gate and Elizabeth saw his face, something in her chest did a complicated, unwelcome thing that she immediately decided to ignore. Nathaniel Hawthorne dismounted without ceremony, held the reins in one hand, and looked at her across the gate with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his default when he was doing something he hadn't entirely decided to do yet. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Hawthorne. I won't take much of your time." "You're welcome to whatever you need," she said, because she was her mother's daughter, and manners were not something she surrendered to circumstances. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I need to tell you something, and I'd rather tell it to you directly than have you hear it another way." Elizabeth's jaw set just slightly. "Tell me." "My mother has spoken to Mrs. Prescott this morning." A beat. "About what?" "About an arrangement," he said, "between our families. The words landed quietly, which somehow made them hit harder. Elizabeth looked at him across the gate and did not move and did not speak, and the silence between them was the kind that has weight. "I told her last night that I wouldn't agree to anything without your knowledge," he continued. "She spoke to Mrs. Prescott anyway. The conversation has been framed as exploratory, a suggestion of a possible future arrangement, nothing formal." "Nothing formal," Elizabeth repeated. "No, but public enough that refusing it now becomes its own problem." He held her gaze. "Yes." She turned away from him. Not in anger, she didn't let herself reach for anger yet, because anger was a tool, and she wasn't ready to use it. She turned away, because she needed 3 seconds without being looked at to think clearly, and she took those seconds, and then she turned back. "Your mother is very good at this," she said. "Yes," he said. "She is. And you." She looked at him directly. "Did you know she was going to do it?" "No." He said it without hesitation and without decoration, which was, she noted, how he said everything that mattered. "I didn't." "But you knew she might." A pause. "Yes, I knew she might." "And you didn't stop her." "I wasn't there to stop her," he said. "I was—" He stopped. He looked briefly like a man who was choosing between two honest answers and finding both of them insufficient. "I was writing. I write early. By the time I came back and found out what she'd done, the conversation had already happened." Elizabeth looked at him. He met her eyes without looking away, and that steadiness, that refusal to perform either guilt or justification, was the thing she found most difficult to dismiss. "What do you want me to do with this information, Mr. Hawthorne?" she said. "I want you to be angry at the right person," he said, "not me. You're standing at my gate. You're the person I owe an explanation." "What about what you owe yourself?" she said, and something sharpened in her voice that she hadn't meant to let through. "You came here to tell me your mother arranged something without your consent. But you said yourself that you knew she might, and you went riding instead of making sure she didn't. That's not innocence, Mr. Hawthorne. That's convenience." The muscle in his jaw moved, just once. "That's fair," he said. "I know it's fair," she said. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't act like I needed to know it was fair." Another silence. He looked at her across the gate, and she looked back, and this was the third silence of their strange brief acquaintance, and like the others, it said more than any of the words on either side of it. "What do you intend to do?" he asked. "That depends," she said, "on what has actually been said to Mrs. Prescott, and what form the arrangement was presented in, and how far the suggestion has traveled since this morning." She paused. "Which you probably know more of than I do. Mrs. Prescott was told that the situation last night was less scandalous than it appeared, and that my family and yours had a long-standing acquaintance that provided context." He said it steadily. "She was also told that a formal connection between the families was something my mother had been considering for some time." "Your mother has been considering no such thing." "No." "She invented it this morning." "Yes." Elizabeth breathed out slowly. "So now, refusing the arrangement means calling Mrs. Hawthorne a liar, which damages your family. Accepting it means I'm bound to a fiction to protect a reputation I shouldn't have needed to protect." She looked at him. "And where does that leave me?" "That," he said quietly, "is exactly the question I came here to ask you." She was not expecting that. He saw it on her face, the small arrested shift of someone who had braced against a wall and found the wall wasn't there. He didn't press it. He just waited, holding his horse's reins with the patience of a man who had learned that some answers only came if you gave them room. "You came here to ask me what I want," she said. "I came here to tell you the truth first," he said. "The question follows from it." He looked at the gate between them, and then he did something she wasn't expecting. He reached over and unlatched it. He didn't open it. He just unlatched it so that the only thing keeping it closed was habit. "May I come in?" A beat. Then she stepped back from it. He led the horse inside and tied the reins to the post by the water trough. The way someone ties a horse who knows the property, which he didn't. but he moved with such quiet confidence that it looked that way. Then he turned and looked at her in the full morning light. And without the dim sitting room and the crisis atmosphere and the weight of both their mothers in the air between them, he looked, she thought, considerably more human. "I'm told by my mother," he said, "that the only sensible resolution is a formal engagement, a public announcement at the Alderton gathering next week, and a quiet dissolution in November after the mill contract is renewed and the Prescotts have moved on to something else. And I'm told," she said, "that by accepting that I'm purchasing safety with a lie and teaching everyone around me that women's reputations are so fragile, they require monthly maintenance." He looked at her. "Is there a version of this you could accept?" She thought about it honestly. "Maybe," she said. "Not the lie, not the false engagement." She paused. "But if the story could simply become less interesting, if people could be given something true to talk about instead of something invented, and if that truth were boring enough that they eventually stopped talking at all." "What truth did you have in mind?" She looked at him. "That you employ my father for a land survey he's been unable to book for 3 years. That the connection between our families is professional rather than romantic. That I was at the party as a courtesy because of that professional connection, and that the East Wing incident was exactly what I said it was." She paused. "None of that is exciting. None of it gives Mrs. Prescott anything to do with. And all of it is defensible because all of it can be made true." He was quiet for a moment. "My father is a surveyor," she said, reading his silence. "A good one. He hasn't had a contract with a large estate in 4 years because Thomas Millbrook put it about that he was slow," Nathaniel said. Elizabeth blinked. "How do you know that?" "Because Thomas Millbrook said the same thing about the man I hired to manage my east fields, and that man proved him wrong in 1 season." He looked at her steadily. "Your father is Thomas Carter." "Yes. He mapped the Harrison property in 2009. I've seen the survey. It was excellent work." Something rose in Elizabeth's chest so fast she almost couldn't manage it. Pride and grief together, the particular combination that comes from hearing someone acknowledge something that deserved acknowledgement years too late. "Yes," she said carefully. "It was. If I offer him the Hawthorne estate survey, the proper contract at market rate with a letter of reference on completion, is that something he'd accept?" She looked at him for a long time. She looked at him the way she had looked at him in his room the night before, and the sitting room, and across the gate carefully, without pretense, trying to see past the surface of him, to whatever was actually there. "Why are you doing this?" she said. "I told you last night that you did nothing wrong," he said. "My family's situation has created consequences for you that you didn't earn. Offering your father a contract doesn't fix that, but it's something I can actually do." "It's also very convenient," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is. Something can be convenient and still be right." She looked at him. He looked back. "There's a condition," she said. "Name it." "The contract is between you and my father. My father negotiates it, signs it, and completes it. I have no part in it. If it becomes known that the survey was arranged to manage a social situation, it becomes worthless for my father and for you." She held his gaze. "I need to know you understand that." "Understood," he said. "And if anyone, your mother, Mrs. Prescott, anyone suggests that the survey is connected to me in any way, you correct that impression immediately and completely." "I will." "And Mr. Hawthorne, Miss Carter. If my father's work is not excellent enough to stand on its own, you tell him so honestly, and you don't give him the reference. I would rather he have no contract than a courtesy one." She said it clearly, plainly, without any softening. "We don't need charity. We need fair." Something happened in Nathaniel Hawthorne's face. It wasn't dramatic. It was very small. The kind of change that happens in a person's expression when they are confronted with something they were not expecting to respect as much as they do. He was quiet for just long enough that she noticed, and then he said, "Your father will get fair. I can promise that." "Then we have an arrangement," she said. "A professional one." "Yes," he said. We do. He untied his horse and mounted with the same quiet efficiency as everything else he did, and he turned toward the gate, and he was nearly through it when he stopped. Miss Carter. She waited. The story about Caesar leading you to my room, he said without turning. It's a better story than anything my mother invented. I know, she said. It has the advantage of being true. Caesar doesn't follow strangers. She paused. No, in 12 years he has not once followed a person he did not choose to follow. He looked at her over his shoulder, and his expression was the most open she had seen it, guarded, still, but open like a door that was closed, but no longer locked. He has very good judgment. He rode out before she could answer. Elizabeth stood in the yard and watched the road after he was gone, and she told herself again that she didn't care what Nathaniel Hawthorne thought, and she believed it slightly less than she had that morning, and considerably less than she had the night before. She told her mother about the survey that evening after supper, while they were clearing the table. Her mother listened without interrupting, which meant she was either very pleased or very alarmed, and Elizabeth couldn't tell which until the end. Your father won't accept charity, Sarah said. I told him that. He agreed to fare. Another pause. You believe him? Elizabeth thought about the way he had said your father will get fare, the absence of flourish, the flatness of a man who said things he meant because saying things he didn't mean was a waste of his time. Yes, she said. I believe him. Her mother dried a plate in silence. Then, and what does he get from it? A good survey, Elizabeth said, and a narrative that serves everyone. Her mother set the plate down, looked at her daughter across the kitchen table with the particular expression she reserved for moments when Elizabeth had done something Sarah hadn't taught her, but recognized anyway. You negotiated, her mother said. Yes. With Nathaniel Hawthorne? Yes. Across your own front gate. He unlatched it himself, Elizabeth said. Her mother looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Then she picked up the next plate and dried it and said, That man is either going to be the best thing that's happened to this family or the most complicated. He might be both, Elizabeth said. Most good things are, her mother said. And that was the end of the conversation. Doug. Her father was harder. Thomas Carter was a quiet man with large hands and the kind of dignity that comes not from position but from principle, and he did not like receiving things he hadn't asked for. Elizabeth sat with him on the porch after supper and told him about the survey in careful, factual terms, and she watched his jaw set in a way that was entirely familiar. I don't need Hawthorne's pity, he said. It isn't pity, she said. He's seen your Harrison survey. He said it was excellent work. He doesn't know my work. He said he's seen the Harrison survey, she repeated. He knows Thomas Millbrook's opinion of it, and he dismissed it. He wants the Hawthorne estate surveyed, and he wants it done well. He came to me because of the situation, yes, but he came to you because of the work. Her father was quiet. Papa? She waited until he looked at her. I'm not asking you to accept it for me. I'm asking you to consider it on its own terms, the way you'd consider any job. It isn't any job, he said. No, it's a better one than you've had in 4 years, and it's for the largest estate in the county, and if the letter of reference is half what it could be, it changes everything about the next 10 years. She looked at him steadily. I made him promise fair, not courtesy. If the work isn't good enough, he'll say so. I told him you'd want it that way. Her father looked at her for a long moment. You told him that? Yes. What did he say? He agreed to it without arguing. Her father looked out at the road. The evening had cooled slightly the way Virginia evenings sometimes did if you waited long enough, and somewhere in the near distance a whip-poor-will had started its insistent repetitive call. I'll think on it, he said. That's all I'm asking, she said. She stood to go inside, and her father said, without looking at her, Elizabeth. Yes, Papa, you did well last night, the way your mother tells it. He still didn't look at her, which was how she knew he meant it entirely. You kept your head. She stood there for a moment, holding those words carefully, the way you hold something that might not survive being handled too roughly." "I had good reason to," she said quietly. "It's our name." She went inside. Her father sat with the whip poor will and the cooling evening for a while longer, and when he came in at last he went directly to his desk and got out his survey instruments and laid them on the table, and neither Elizabeth nor her mother said a word about it. Wednesday arrived. The gossip arrived with it faster and more comprehensive than Elizabeth had anticipated, which meant someone at Hawthorne Hall had talked within the first 24 hours, which meant it was not the housemaids or the footman, but someone closer to the family. Someone who had understood enough of what happened to make the story interesting and had decided that interesting was worth more than loyalty. By Wednesday morning, the county knew 3 things. First, that Elizabeth Carter had been found alone in Nathaniel Hawthorne's private chamber on the night of the summer gathering. Second, that the encounter had lasted well into the night. Third, that a formal arrangement between the families was being considered. The third piece was Margaret Hawthorne's work. The first 2 were something else. Elizabeth found out the shape of the story from Lucy Marsh, who came back to the gate on Wednesday with an expression that had lost its curiosity and was carrying something more complicated in its place. "I thought you should know," Lucy said, "before you go into the village, what they're saying." "Tell me," Elizabeth said. Lucy told her. Elizabeth listened to all of it without speaking, and when Lucy finished, she said thank you, and she meant it, and she stood at the gate for a long moment after Lucy left, thinking about reach and speed, and how a story that wasn't true could get so far ahead of a story that was. Then she went inside and told her mother she needed to go to the village, and her mother looked at her face and said, "I'll come with you." And Elizabeth said, "No." And her mother looked at her for 3 full seconds and then stepped back. "Don't let them see you angry," her mother said. "I won't," Elizabeth said. "I'm not angry. I'm clear." She walked to the village alone in her second-best dress, with her back straight and her hands still, and she walked into the general store, where she knew she would find Mrs. Alderton and Mrs. Prescott, and at least 2 other women who had been at the summer gathering, and she did not give any of them the chance to speak first. "Good morning," she said pleasantly and directly in the voice her mother had spent 15 years building in her. "I understand there's a story going around about me. I thought I'd come and see if anyone wanted to hear the true version." The silence in the store had the quality of a room collectively inhaling. Mrs. Prescott looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has been caught in the middle of something she would prefer to be on the outside of. Mrs. Alderton, to her credit, looked slightly ashamed. Elizabeth told the story again. Clearly. Calmly. The dog and the thorn and the chair and the tired feet and the torn petticoat, and then Mrs. Hawthorne finding her, and the conversation in the sitting room, and her refusal of the engagement. She left nothing out except the part about the survey because that was her father's to tell. When she finished, she looked around the room. "I can't make you believe me," she said. "I can only tell you what happened. What you do with it is your own business." She paused. "But if any of you have daughters of your own, I'd ask you to think about what kind of county you want your daughters to grow up in. One where a woman who helps a hurt animal in the dark can have her name ruined for it. Or one where we ask the right questions before we build the story." She bought the flower she'd actually come in for, said good morning to each person individually, and walked back out into the street. She was 3 paces from the door when she heard Mrs. Alderton say quietly, but not quietly enough, "She's got nerve, that girl." Elizabeth walked home with the flower on her hip and the sun on her face, and the feeling not quite relief, not quite triumph, something quieter and more durable than either of a woman who had said the true thing in the hard room and hadn't apologized for it. What she didn't know and wouldn't know until later was that Nathaniel Hawthorne had ridden into the village from the opposite direction 20 minutes before she arrived. That he had gone to the same general store first. That he had said to whoever was in it at the time that his family's hunting dog Caesar had been injured at the gathering and had been tended to by Thomas Carter's daughter, and that the incident in the East Wing was exactly what it appeared to be, a woman caring for an animal and nothing more, and that his mother had been considering a professional arrangement with the Carter family, for some time in any case. He had managed it, quietly without drama before she got there. She would find out about it later from Lucy Marsh, who heard it from the blacksmith who had been in the store when Nathaniel came in, and she would stand in her kitchen holding that information for a long moment, understanding two things simultaneously: that he had done it without being asked, without telling her, without wanting credit for it, and that this was either the act of a man managing a situation that inconvenienced him, or the act of a man who had decided without making a production of it that she deserved better than to walk into that store alone. She didn't know which one it was. She wasn't sure he knew either. She suspected he was the kind of man who might not find out until considerably later, and then would not know what to do with the answer. She set the flower on the shelf and thought about Caesar thumping his tail and a gate latch lifted from the outside, and she thought privately in that locked part of her mind that this was either the beginning of something or the most complicated nothing she had ever been involved in. She still hadn't decided which when the letter arrived the next morning. It was addressed to Thomas Carter, in Nathaniel Hawthorne's hand. Short, formal, professional, an inquiry about the survey commission rates to be discussed at his convenience, no obligation implied. Elizabeth left it on her father's desk without a word. Her father read it at breakfast, folded it carefully, put it in his pocket and said, "I'll write over Thursday." Her mother met Elizabeth's eyes across the table and said absolutely nothing. None of them needed to. Thomas Carter rode to Hawthorne Hall on Thursday morning the way he said he would, with his survey instruments packed in the worn leather case he'd carried since before Elizabeth was born. He came back in the early afternoon and didn't say much at supper, which was normal for him, and Elizabeth didn't ask which was normal for her, and her mother watched both of them across the table with the expression of a woman who had learned that some information arrived faster when you didn't reach for it. It was her father who broke the silence, finally pushing back from the table and saying in the tone he reserved for things he had decided and was not inviting discussion on, "I start Monday." Her mother said good. Elizabeth said nothing and meant a great deal by it. What her father told her later, piece by piece over the following days, the way he told everything slowly without drama, as though the facts were sufficient, and decoration was for people who didn't trust. Their material was that Nathaniel Hawthorne had met him in the study, not the formal receiving room, which mattered to her father in a way he couldn't quite articulate except to say that a man who meets a tradesman in his study instead of making him wait in the hall was a man who understood something about respect that a lot of men with large estates had managed to avoid learning. They had talked for 2 hours. The commission was real, the rate was fair, the scope was larger than her father had expected, the full eastern boundary, the creek survey, the timber assessment, and there had been no mention of Elizabeth. Not once. Not by name, not by implication, not by any of the small social signals that men used when they were doing a woman a favor and wanted credit for it. He talked about the land, her father said. Just the land. Good. Elizabeth said the same way her mother had. He asked good questions, her father added, which from Thomas Carter was approximately the highest compliment available. Elizabeth went to bed that night feeling something she hadn't quite felt since the summer gathering. Not relief and not hope exactly, but the particular steadiness that comes from a situation moving the way it should, the way it would have moved all along if people had been fair. She lay in the dark and thought about a man who had ridden to her gate and talked to her honestly, and then gone into the village before her, and managed the story, and sent a professional letter to her father, and met him in his study, and she thought carefully with the part of her mind that she tried to keep separate from the part that felt things that she still didn't know what any of it meant. Whether it was a man who was good or a man who was managing. Whether those were even different things. She fell asleep before she reached a conclusion, which was she suspected the only mercy available. The Alderton gathering was in 10 days. Margaret Hawthorne had not withdrawn the suggestion of a formal arrangement. Elizabeth knew this not because anyone told her directly, but because the silence around the subject had the particular shape of something being deliberately not discussed, which was louder than most conversations she had ever been part of. Mrs. Alderton had called on her mother twice in the intervening week, social calls, both of them, with no stated purpose, which meant they had a purpose that wasn't being stated. Lucy Marsh reported that Mrs. Prescott had said something at the milliner's about waiting to see how things developed, which in the language of Virginia society in 1816 meant she was watching, and her watching had weight. Elizabeth understood the mathematics. She had understood them since Wednesday morning in the general store. The story had been slowed, but not stopped. Her father's survey had given the county something else to talk about, something respectable, something that reframed the connection between the families as professional. But the Alderton gathering was the next public occasion, where everyone who mattered would be in the same room, and whatever happened there would set the shape of the story for the rest of the year. She told none of this to her mother. Her mother already knew. What she did instead was go to the Hawthorne Hall on the following Tuesday by herself, on foot, arriving at the front gate in the mid-morning and asking the man at the gate if Mrs. Hawthorne was receiving. She was receiving. The message that came back with the gate man was terse, simply, "Yes, come in." And Elizabeth walked up the main path with her hands still and her breathing even and the full awareness that she was doing something that a more cautious woman would not do, and that being more cautious was an option she had considered and set aside. Margaret Hawthorne received her in the morning room. She was already seated when Elizabeth was shown in, which was not an accident. The older woman was not the kind of person who allowed things like seating arrangements to be accidents. And she gestured to the chair across from her with the efficiency of a woman whose time was organized and who expected the same of her guests. "Miss Carter," she said, "I wasn't expecting you." "I know," Elizabeth said, sitting. "I wanted to speak to you before the Alderton gathering, and I thought it was better to do it directly than to wait and find out what you'd arranged in the meantime." A pause that had amusement somewhere in the back of it. "You're very frank." "I was told it wouldn't serve me," Elizabeth said. "I've said that before, and I'll likely keep saying it because it keeps being relevant." Margaret looked at her with the full measuring attention of a woman who had been assessing people for 50 years and had gotten very good at it. "What did you want to say?" "I wanted to understand what you intend to do at the Alderton gathering," Elizabeth said. "And I wanted you to understand what I intend to do so that neither of us does something that makes the other one's position harder." "That's a very reasonable approach." "I'm a reasonable person," Elizabeth said. "When people give me the opportunity to be." Margaret's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but something in that direction. "And when they don't?" "Then I'm something else," Elizabeth said pleasantly. The older woman looked at her for a moment. "My son told me about your conversation at the gate," she said. "He said you negotiated rather than capitulated." "Did he think that was a problem? He thought it was interesting." Margaret set down her cup. "I thought it was inconvenient. I've since revised that assessment." Elizabeth waited. "The formal arrangement suggestion was a mistake," Margaret said with the directness of a woman who found admission of error more efficient than avoiding it. "Not because it was wrong in principle, but because I did it without consulting you, and that made it something it shouldn't have been." She looked at Elizabeth squarely. "I don't apologize for trying to protect my family, but I should have spoken to you first." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "You should have." Another pause. "You're not going to make that easier for me, are you?" "I accepted your apology," Elizabeth said. "I didn't say I was going to pretend it didn't happen." Margaret Hawthorne looked at her for a long considering moment, and then she laughed, a short, genuine sound. Not the social laugh Elizabeth had heard from her at the gathering, but something more private and more real. "My son," she said, "is going to have a very interesting life." Elizabeth felt the heat in her face before she could stop it, and that annoyed her more than anything that had happened in the past week. "Mrs. Hawthorne." "I'm not suggesting anything formal," the older woman said with the precision of someone making a legal distinction. "I'm simply observing." She picked up her cup again. "Now, the Alderton gathering. What did you want to say?" What they arranged between them in the morning room of Hawthorne Hall, with the sound of Thomas Carter working somewhere in the eastern fields beyond the window, was this: Margaret would not raise the subject of any arrangement at the gathering. Elizabeth would attend because not attending would look like hiding. The professional connection between the families would be the public explanation for any association between them, and neither woman would do anything to suggest a different explanation. If anyone asked directly, They would each answer directly and without elaborating. It was not a comfortable arrangement. It was a workable one, which was better. Elizabeth was nearly to the door when Margaret said, "Miss Carter." She turned. "My son will be at the gathering," Margaret said. "He rarely attends social events willingly. I believe he intends to come to this one." Elizabeth looked at her. "I thought you should know," the older woman said, with the expression of a woman who was giving information and not one single thing more, and was very clear about the distinction. "Thank you," Elizabeth said. She walked back to the Carter farm with the same straight back and still hands she'd walked over with, and she thought about a man who rarely attended social events willingly. And she thought about a gate latch lifted from the outside, and she thought for the 100th time, and with the same inconclusive result, that she still didn't know what any of it meant. She was beginning to think that not knowing was its own kind of answer, and she wasn't sure she liked it. The Alderton gathering was on a Friday evening, and Elizabeth arrived with her mother and without her father, who had a legitimate excuse in the survey, and used it with the relief of a man who understood that some rooms were not improved by his presence in them. Sarah Carter wore her best dress and her best expression, the one that said she was here willingly and for her own reasons and didn't need anyone's assessment of that. And Elizabeth wore the same dress she'd worn to the summer gathering, because she had 2 good dresses, and she was not going to pretend she had 3. The room was full when they arrived. Elizabeth registered this in the first 10 seconds, the number of people, the configuration of them, who was talking to whom, and with what degree of visible interest. She saw Mrs. Prescott near the east window with 2 of her daughters, both of whom were watching the door. She saw Mrs. Alderton moving between groups with the purpose of a woman who had organized this event and was managing its progress. She saw Lucy Marsh, who caught her eye and gave her a small private nod that said, "I'm here, and I'm on your side," which was worth more than Lucy probably knew. She did not immediately see Nathaniel Hawthorne. She was not looking for him. She told herself this clearly and believed approximately 2/3 of it. Her mother took her arm and guided her toward the refreshment table with the easy authority of a woman who had walked into difficult rooms before and knew that movement was better than standing still. They talked to Mrs. Alderton, who was gracious and warm in a way that said she had decided which side of this situation she was on. They talked to Reverend Whitmore, who said something careful and non-committal about the Carter family's long service to the community that Elizabeth interpreted as neither condemnation nor endorsement, which from Reverend Whitmore was roughly equivalent to a declaration of support. They moved through the room, and Elizabeth kept her voice steady and her eyes direct, and she did not look toward the door. She felt him before she saw him, not in any dramatic sense. She simply became aware in the way you become aware of weather changing that the quality of the room had shifted slightly. A subtle reorientation of attention, the way people's bodies angle almost imperceptibly toward a presence they've registered without consciously deciding to register it. She turned, and he was standing near the entrance, talking to Mr. Alderton, wearing dark clothes again, because apparently that was what he wore. And he looked exactly as he had every other time she had seen him, contained slightly separate. The expression of a man present in the room, but not surrendered to it. And then he looked up and found her face across the room, directly without searching, as though he had known where she was before he looked. She held his gaze for 1 second. He held hers. Then she turned back to the conversation she'd been having with Mrs. Whitmore, and she said something sensible about the summer harvest, and she did not look at him again for 20 minutes. When she did, he was 3 feet away. "Miss Carter," he said. "Good evening." "Mr. Hawthorne," she kept her voice even. "I didn't know you attended the Alderton gatherings." "I don't generally," he said. There was the briefest pause. "I made an exception." Her mother had stepped away with the timing of a woman who had not orchestrated this and would deny doing so if asked. Elizabeth stood with Nathaniel Hawthorne in the middle of the Alderton gathering and looked at him and said, "Your mother told me you might come. She told me she'd spoken to you," he said, "about the arrangement. She apologized." "I know, she told me that too." His expression was difficult to read, which she was learning was its default state, not closed, but careful. I'm glad she did. It was a good apology, Elizabeth said honestly. She didn't qualify it. She doesn't when she means it. He looked at her steadily. Are we all right? The four of us are families. Are we at a place that works? She thought about the morning room and the professional arrangement and her father packing his instruments on Monday morning. I think so, she said. If everyone does what they said they'd do. We will, he said. I know you will, she said. I'm less certain about everyone else. He almost smiled. She caught it at the edges, the very beginning of it before his face settled back into its careful lines. You're the least deferential person I've met in 6 years of social gatherings, he said. I'll take that as a compliment. It was one, he said. And that was the moment Mrs. Prescott chose to arrive at Elizabeth's left elbow with the precision of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this configuration and had decided she'd waited long enough. Mr. Hawthorne, she said with the warmth of someone performing warmth rather than feeling it. And Miss Carter, how lovely. I was just saying to my daughter that it was good to see the Carter family here this evening. Mrs. Carter and I have been here for an hour, Elizabeth said pleasantly. We've had a very nice time. Yes, of course. Mrs. Prescott's smile didn't shift. Mr. Hawthorne, I understand there's some professional arrangement between your estate and the Carter family. A survey, was it? Thomas Carter is surveying the Hawthorne eastern boundary, Nathaniel said. His voice was level. He's the best surveyor in the county. I should have engaged him years ago. Mrs. Prescott's smile acquired a very slight tension around the edges. How enterprising. And I suppose that explains the connection between your families. She let the word connection do all the work she intended it to do, which was considerable. Elizabeth felt the moment arrive the way you feel. Whether before it happens, a change in pressure, a sense of something that was about to come down. The connection, Nathaniel said before Elizabeth could speak, began with my dog. He said it clearly, in a voice that carried because he was the kind of man whose voice carried whether he wanted it to or not. Miss Carter found Caesar injured in the garden at the summer gathering. She removed the thorn from his paw, stayed to make sure he was settled, and fell asleep in the chair beside him. I came in and found her there. I then behaved somewhat poorly in the first 10 minutes, for which I've since apologized. He paused. The survey is a separate matter. It's good business. The two things are not connected except that they both involve the Carter family, who have consistently behaved with more integrity than most people I encounter. The silence that followed this statement had a very particular quality. Elizabeth was aware of other conversations nearby that had quieted. She was aware of Mrs. Alderton 3 feet to her left, who had the expression of a woman watching something she had not organized but was glad to be present for. She was aware of her own heartbeat, which was doing something inconvenient. Mrs. Prescott recovered quickly because she was a woman who had been recovering quickly from things for 40 years. How very loyal of you, Mr. Hawthorne, she said. No, he said. Just accurate. He looked at Elizabeth then briefly, with an expression that was not asking for acknowledgement and not seeking approval, and was simply there. Present. The look of a man who had done something because it was right, and was not going to perform either modesty or pride about it. She looked back and said nothing, because sometimes nothing was the right thing to say, and this was one of those times. Mrs. Prescott excused herself with a smile that had gone rigid, and the small group dispersed, and Elizabeth's mother appeared at her shoulder with a cup of punch, and the expression of a woman who had witnessed everything from across the room and had processed it fully, and would not say a single word about it until they were home. Thank you, Elizabeth said to Nathaniel quietly. I said what was accurate, he said. You said it in that room. It needed to be said in that room. She looked at him. You didn't have to, Miss Carter. He said it with a patience that wasn't condescension, just the patience of a man who was about to say something he'd been working toward for a while. I have spent the last 10 days watching you handle a situation that my family's actions created and handle it with more grace and more intelligence than it deserved. The least I could do is say the true thing loudly enough that people heard it. She was quiet for a moment. That's the second time you've said something I wasn't expecting. What was the first? I meant what I said. You did nothing wrong. She held his gaze. You said it in the hallway. You didn't have to then either. He looked at her with that recalculating expression, the one she'd catalogued from the very first night, the one she'd been seeing on his face in various configurations ever since. And this time, she could read it better than she had before. It wasn't coldness. It had never been coldness. It was the expression of a man who was very careful about what he let himself want, and was in the process of encountering something that was making careful considerably harder than it usually was. I'm going to say something now, he said, and I'd ask you to let me finish before you respond. All right, she said. I don't know what this is, he said. Between us. I'm aware that sounds like an insufficient thing to say in the middle of a drawing room, but I'm trying to be accurate rather than eloquent, and the accurate thing is that I don't know. I know that I've thought about you every day since the night I came into my room and found you there. I know that your conversation is the most honest I've had in years, possibly longer. I know that every time you say something you mean it, and I have spent so much of my life in rooms full of people who don't mean what they say that I'm not entirely sure how to behave around someone who does. He paused. I'm not saying this to begin anything. I'm saying it because you have been more honest with me than I've been with you, and that's an imbalance I'd like to correct. Elizabeth looked at him. She looked at him for long enough that a lesser man might have started filling the silence, and he did not, because he was not a lesser man, and he had said what he came to say, and was waiting for the answer. Nathaniel Hawthorne, she said. Miss Carter. If you had said any of that with flowers and speeches and the expectation of a grateful response, I would have walked away. I know, he said. But you didn't. No, so. She held his gaze steadily. I don't know what this is either. I know that I've thought about the gate latch more than I should. I know that the fact that you went to the village before I did and didn't tell me matters to me more than it would to most people. She paused. And I know that I said I didn't want to be watched, and I meant it, and what you just described is not watching, it's something else, and I don't have the right word for it yet. Neither do I, he said. That's honest, she said. I'm trying, he said. She looked at him a moment longer. So am I, she said. It was not a declaration, and it was not a beginning, and it was not a resolution. It was two people in the middle of a room full of other people who had been looking at them for the past 10 minutes, saying something true to each other and not dressing it up as anything more than what it was, which Elizabeth thought was exactly what both of them needed it to be. Margaret Hawthorne found Elizabeth near the end of the evening when the party had thinned enough that a private word was possible without appearing to be a private word. Miss Carter, she said. Mrs. Hawthorne. I saw you speaking with my son. You did. He looked. She paused, and the pause was not strategic. It was the pause of a woman choosing words for something she felt rather than something she was managing. He looked like himself, more than he has in quite some time, Elizabeth said carefully. He was very honest. That's the most him thing possible, Margaret said. He doesn't know how to be anything else, which has cost him a great deal socially. She looked at Elizabeth with the direct gaze that Elizabeth was realizing ran in the family. It's not always an easy quality in a man. No, Elizabeth agreed. But it's the one I'd choose over the alternatives. Margaret studied her. Yes, she said after a moment. I think you would. She moved away. Elizabeth watched her go and thought about families and what they carried in them, the qualities that ran through generations, like threads through cloth. The things you recognized in a child's face that came from long before. She thought about her own family, her father's dignity, her mother's precision, the combination of both that had made her whoever she was. She thought about what it would mean to add something to that or to have it added to. She thought about gate latches and honest voices and men who went to villages quietly before you got there and said nothing about it afterward. She was still thinking when someone grabbed her arm from behind. Not gently. The grip was firm, and her body responded before her mind caught up. She turned sharply, pulling back, and found herself facing a man she didn't recognize immediately. Middle-aged, florid, with the look of someone who had been drinking since before the party started. The name arrived a second later, Harlan Prescott. Mrs. Prescott's brother-in-law. She had met him once years ago at a church social. "Miss Carter," he said with the kind of smile that had something wrong underneath it. "I've been wanting a word." "Mr. Prescott." She kept her voice even. "You're hurting my arm." He didn't release it. "I just wanted to say," he said with the careful articulation of a man managing his own drunkenness, "that women who make fools of themselves in a man's bedroom shouldn't be so proud about it afterward." The room had not gone quiet. The people nearest them hadn't heard. Elizabeth was aware of this with a cold, clear awareness, aware that she could answer him quietly and manage this, or she could answer him as she chose to. She chose. "Let go of my arm," she said at the volume of a woman who was not going to be quiet about it. Now, he didn't. He started to say something else. She didn't hear what it was, because at that precise moment, a hand landed on Harlan Prescott's shoulder from behind, and the effect was immediate and total. The man's body stiffened, and the drink-loosened confidence in his face rearranged itself into something more sober, and he released Elizabeth's arm. She didn't look back to see who was there. She already knew. "Mr. Prescott," Nathaniel Hawthorne's voice said from behind her, quiet and absolutely flat. "I think you've had a long evening." "Hawthorne," Harlan said with the bravado of a man who is very aware he's lost the room. "I know what you were doing," Nathaniel said. The flatness in his voice was not anger. It was something past anger, something that had been anger for long enough that it had become something harder and quieter and more final. "You're going to go find your coat, and you're going to leave, and you're going to remember on the ride home that how a man speaks to a woman in a public room is a reflection of his character, not hers." Harlan Prescott looked at him. At Elizabeth. At the people nearby who had now stopped pretending not to listen. He straightened his jacket and walked away without another word, and the room exhaled. Elizabeth turned. Nathaniel was standing 2 feet away, looking at her with the controlled stillness of a man who had just done something that cost him something and was managing that cost. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. She was. Her arm would bruise, but she was all right. "I should have—" "You were exactly in time," she said. "Not before. Exactly in time." He looked at her. "Most people would have wanted me to prevent it." "I handled the first part," she said. "You handled the second. That's how it should work." She held his gaze. "Don't apologize for the timing. I told him to let go. He needed to hear me say it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that expression, the recalculating one, except it had changed again. It had lost some of its distance. Whatever he was recalculating now was closer and more personal, and she could see it happening, and she let it happen without looking away. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Hawthorne. Would you—" He stopped. Tried again. "May I call on your family next week properly, in the afternoon?" She looked at him. "The survey is progressing well," she said. "There's no need for—" "Not about the survey," he said. The silence between them was different from all the other silences. It wasn't surprise, and it wasn't calculation, and it wasn't the weight of other people's opinions pressing down on both of them. It was something quieter than all of that. Something that had been coming for 11 days and had arrived finally without drama in the middle of the Alderton gathering, with the smell of punch in the air and the sound of the fiddle starting up in the next room. "Yes," she said. "You may." He nodded once the way he did everything, without flourish, without performance. "Good evening, Miss Carter." "Good evening, Mr. Hawthorne." He walked away. She watched him go, and she thought clearly, without the locked-away qualifier, without the private caveat, that she was in a great deal of trouble, and that she had never in her life been less sorry about anything. Her mother appeared at her shoulder, said nothing, handed her a cup of punch. Elizabeth took it and drank it and looked at the room full of people who had watched the entire evening unfold, and she thought about how a story that starts with a dog can get very far before you realize where it's going. She thought it had probably gotten somewhere worth going. He came on Tuesday, not Monday, which Elizabeth had half expected, and not Wednesday, which would have felt like he'd reconsidered. Tuesday was deliberate enough time that it wasn't desperate close enough that it was honest. She had learned to read him in these small calibrations, and that was itself a thing she hadn't accounted for when this started. That she would learn his rhythms. That she would start to know what his choices meant before he explained them. Her mother had baked that morning. She didn't say why. Elizabeth didn't ask. He arrived at 2 in the afternoon, tied his horse at the post without ceremony, and knocked on the front door like a man calling on a family, rather than a man making a social performance of calling on a family. Thomas Carter answered it, which surprised all three of them. Her father rarely came in from the fields before 4, and there was a moment on the porch that Elizabeth didn't witness, but heard from the kitchen, just low voices, and the particular silence that exists between two men deciding whether they understand each other. Then her father called her name. She came out of the kitchen wiping her hands on her apron, and she did not take the apron off first, because taking it off would have been a performance, and she wasn't performing anything today. Nathaniel Hawthorne stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and looked at her the way he'd looked at her across the Alderton room, directly without social softening, and said, "Good afternoon, Miss Carter." "Good afternoon," she said. "Come in." Her father shook Nathaniel's hand once, said something about checking on the East Field measurement, and left with the tact of a man who understood exactly what was happening and was choosing for reasons of his own to permit it. Her mother brought tea and set it on the table, and also left, which meant both her parents had decided something without discussing it in front of her, which was both touching and slightly alarming. She sat across from him. The table between them was the same table she had eaten breakfast on every morning of her life, worn smooth at the edges, where her father rested his forearms, marked faintly near one corner where a candle had once tipped. It was as unheroic a setting as could be imagined, and she was glad for it. "You said not about the survey," she said. "It's not about the survey," he confirmed. "Then say what it's about." He set his hat on the table, looked at her. "I've been thinking about what I said at the Alderton gathering," he said. "That I don't know what this is. I want to be more precise than that." "All right. I know what I'd like it to be," he said. "I've known that for longer than is probably reasonable given how little time has passed. What I don't know is whether what I'd like it to be is something you would choose, and I don't want to arrange anything or suggest anything or move in any direction without knowing that." She looked at him. "You're asking me before you do anything." "I'm asking you before I do anything," he said. "Yes. That's different from most men." "I'm aware." She was quiet for a moment. "What would you like it to be?" she said. "Honest," he said without hesitating. "Equal. Something you entered because you chose it, not because a situation made it convenient, or because your family needed the protection of my name." He paused. "I have enough of everything that matters very little. Land, money, standing. I don't have—" He stopped. He was not. She had learned a man who struggled with words often, and when he did, it was because he was trying to say something true, and finding that true things were sometimes harder to carry than eloquent ones. "I don't have anyone who talks to me the way you do," he said. "Like the truth is the starting point, not the destination." Elizabeth looked at the worn surface of the table, at the candle mark in the corner, at the cup in her hand. "I told my mother," she said slowly, "after the first night that I didn't want to be watched. I meant it. What I didn't understand then was the difference between being watched and being seen." She looked up at him. "You see things. You saw what my father's survey meant before I explained it. You saw what I needed at the Alderton gathering, not to be rescued, but to be backed. You saw the difference." She paused. "Most people don't." "Most people don't look," he said. "No," she said. "They don't." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had said something that mattered and were letting it settle before they said the next thing. "I'm not easy," she said. I want you to know that before you go further. I have opinions that I don't soften because they're inconvenient. I will argue with you when I think you're wrong. I don't intend to become a smaller version of myself to fit the space available. I know that, he said. You know it in theory. I've seen it in practice, he said, repeatedly. And there it was again, the edge of that almost smile. Miss Carter, I came here precisely because of those things, not in spite of them. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, Then we can try, honestly, slowly, without either of us deciding what it is before it's had time to show us. That's all I'm asking, he said. Good, she said. Then have your tea. My mother made the biscuits herself, and she'll know if you didn't eat them. He ate 2 biscuits. He stayed for an hour. Her father came back in before he left, and the 3 of them talked about the survey for 20 minutes, and it was the most ordinary thing that had happened in 3 weeks, and Elizabeth thought it might be the best thing. After he rode out, her mother came into the kitchen and poured herself a cup of cold tea, and said without looking up, Well, don't, Elizabeth said. I said nothing. You were about to say several things. I was going to say, her mother said, that he drinks tea like a man who doesn't notice whether it's good or bad, which either means he was too busy paying attention to you to notice the tea, or that he has no palate whatsoever. She paused. I prefer the first interpretation. Mama. He ate the biscuits, her mother said. That's always a good sign. The weeks that followed were careful and real, and not what Elizabeth had imagined in the rare moments she had allowed herself to imagine anything. He came on Tuesdays and sometimes Saturdays. He brought nothing the first 3 times. No flowers, no gifts, no social currency, and she liked him more for it each time. He talked to her father about the survey in terms that were genuinely engaged, not performed, and she watched her father's assessment of him shift week by week, from cautious acceptance to something approaching respect, which from Thomas Carter was a longer journey than it was for most people. He asked her questions. Not the social questions, not what she liked or who she admired or what her accomplishments were, but the underneath questions. What she thought about the way the county handled poor relief. What she made of the new road proposals. What she believed about education, about land rights, about the things that organized a life. He listened to the answers with the full attention of a man who was not waiting for his turn to speak, but was actually receiving what she said. And he disagreed with her sometimes plainly and without apology. And she disagreed back, and after the 3rd argument, she realized that arguing with Nathaniel Hawthorne was one of the more intellectually satisfying things she had done in years, which was either a recommendation for the man or a commentary on the county's general conversational level, and was probably both. She started to know his face better. The way the muscle in his jaw moved when he was holding something back. The way his voice flattened when he was certain about something and loosened when he was uncertain. The way he looked at Caesar, who had taken to sitting between the 2 of them with the proprietary satisfaction of an animal who believed he had arranged this whole situation and wasn't wrong. She did not let herself get ahead of it. She was careful about that, careful the way you're careful on new ice, not with fear, but with attention, testing each step before you put your weight on it. She did not tell herself stories about what was coming. She told herself only what was true now, and what was true now was that she looked forward to Tuesdays, and that his voice in the front room made the house feel different than it did on the other 6 days of the week, and that when he left, she stood at the window and watched the road longer than she needed to. It was enough. She let it be enough. And then on the 4th Saturday, everything shifted. She knew something was wrong before she saw his face. It was in the way he tied his horse faster than usual, less careful. And the way he knocked on the door, which had a different quality to it, something beneath the surface of the sound that her body registered before her mind caught up. When she opened the door, he said, I need to speak with you privately, now, if possible. She stepped out onto the porch and closed the door behind her. What's happened? He was quiet for 1 second, and in that second she read his face and found something she hadn't seen there before. Not the controlled stillness. Something underneath it. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like a man who had been hit by something and hadn't decided yet how to stand back up. "Harland Prescott," he said, "has filed a complaint with the county magistrate." She stared at him. "What kind of complaint?" "He's claiming that the incident at the summer gathering the East Wing was deliberate, that you entered my room intentionally, that there was a prior arrangement between us, and that my family's subsequent handling of the situation constitutes an attempt to manipulate county social structures for financial advantage." He said it flatly, the way he said things he found contemptible, with the particular flatness of a man who refuses to give ugliness the dignity of emotion. "He's suggesting that your father's survey commission was compensation, that the whole thing was arranged." Elizabeth stood very still. "He's saying I planned it." "Yes." "That I deliberately compromised myself in your room as a transaction to get a survey contract for my father." "Yes." The anger arrived then, and it was not the hot kind. It was the cold kind, the kind that comes when something is not just wrong, but specifically personally wrong in a way that reaches back through every hard thing you've ever done and retroactively cheapens it. She thought about the thorn in Caesar's paw. She thought about the torn petticoat. She thought about walking to the village alone in her second-best dress and saying the true thing in the hard room. She thought about her father's face when she told him the survey was real and fair, and the way he had gone to his desk that night and laid out his instruments. "When was the complaint filed?" she said. "This morning." "Does my father know?" "Not yet." She turned and opened the front door. "Papa," she called. "Come out here, please." Thomas Carter's face did not change when they told him. This was the thing about her father. His face did not change, but his hands did. They stilled. He was holding the survey notebook he'd brought out with him, and his hands stilled around it, and Elizabeth watched them and knew that what was happening inside him was considerable. "He's saying Elizabeth arranged the East Wing," he said. Not a question. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "And that the survey is payment." "Yes." Thomas Carter looked at Nathaniel Hawthorne for a long moment. "What's the process?" he said. "The magistrate will likely want statements. From Miss Carter, from me, from the household staff who were present." Nathaniel paused. "And from you regarding the survey commission." "The survey stands on its own," her father said. His voice was even. "The timing is what it is. I can't change the timing." "No," Nathaniel said. "But I can provide documentation that the commission was discussed before I had any awareness of the incident. I asked my steward about available surveyors the week before the gathering. He recommended your name. The inquiry predates everything by 10 days. Elizabeth turned to look at him. "You were already looking for a surveyor." "Yes," he said. "I should have told you that sooner. I didn't because it seemed like something I was adding to justify the arrangement, and I didn't want you to think—" He stopped. "It's true, regardless of how it sounds. My steward has the correspondence." She looked at him steadily. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you made me promise that the contract would stand on its own or not at all," he said. "And I was afraid that telling you I'd been looking for a surveyor before the gathering would sound like I was trying to make the arrangement less complicated than it was. It was already complicated enough. And now," she said, "it's the most important thing." "Yes," he said, "it is." He held her gaze. "I'm sorry. I should have told you." She heard the apology. She noted it. She set it aside for later because there wasn't time for it now. "Who else knows about the complaint?" "My mother, my steward, the magistrate's clerk." He paused. "It will be widely known by Monday." "Then we need to be ready before Monday," she said. She looked at her father. "Papa, will you go to the magistrate yourself today before Prescott has time to frame the story?" Her father looked at her. "You want me to go today?" "I want you to go now," she said, "before anyone else does. Bring the survey agreement. Bring your original inquiry record. Bring everything. Don't wait for the situation to come to you." Thomas Carter looked at his daughter for a moment, with the expression of a man who was recognizing something in her that he had always known was there, but hadn't seen operating at full capacity before. "All right," he said. He went inside. Nathaniel looked at Elizabeth. "I'll go with him." "No," she said. "Miss Carter." "If you go with him, it looks like you're managing it," she said. "It needs to look like my father went on his own, with his own documentation, on his own initiative, because it's the truth, and he knew it, and he didn't wait for anyone to tell him to." She held his gaze. "Your steward sends the correspondence to the magistrate separately. Tonight. Do not attach your name to my father's statement. Let them land independently." He looked at her. The recalculating expression, but faster now. She could see him processing it and arriving at the same place she had. "You're right," he said. "I know," she said. "You're very good at this." "I'm very angry," she said. "Anger focuses me." She crossed her arms. "Go home. Send the correspondence. And Mr. Hawthorne, if your mother has any impulse to manage this situation, tell her from me that the best thing she can do is nothing." He almost smiled, and this time it went slightly further than usual. "She's going to find that difficult." "I imagine she will," Elizabeth said. "Tell her anyway." Her father left within the hour. Her mother knew by then, not because Elizabeth had told her, but because Sarah Carter had been listening from the kitchen window, which was a habit she had never formally acknowledged, and they had never formally discussed. She came out onto the porch after Thomas left and stood beside Elizabeth and looked at the road. "Harlan Prescott," her mother said. "Yes. He did this because Nathaniel embarrassed him at the Alderton gathering." "Yes, and because men like Harlan Prescott D," her mother said with the precision of a woman who had been cataloging men like Harlan Prescott for her entire adult life, cannot tolerate being corrected in public by a woman who wasn't afraid of them. "No," Elizabeth said. "They can't." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Are you all right?" "I'm angry." "That's not what I asked." Elizabeth looked at the road where her father had gone. She thought about everything that was on the line. His reputation, the survey, the mill contract, the schoolhouse fund, the story of the East Wing that had been so carefully and painstakingly rebuilt into something accurate and fair, and was now being dismantled again by a man with a grievance and a magistrate's ear. She thought about all of it, and underneath all of it, she thought about the fact that this was happening because she had followed a hurt dog into a garden and done the decent thing, and the world had found a way to make her pay for it anyway. "I'm tired," she said, "of being required to fight for something that shouldn't need fighting for." Her mother put her hand on Elizabeth's arm. Brief, firm, the way her mother touched things with purpose rather than sentiment. "I know," she said. They stood together on the porch in the afternoon heat, and neither of them said anything else, and sometimes that was exactly the right thing. The magistrate was a man named Horace Graves, 60 years old, with the careful demeanor of someone who had presided over enough county disputes to have lost his faith in anyone's version of events and retained only his faith in documentation. Thomas Carter arrived at his office at 4 in the afternoon with his survey agreement, his original inquiry response, his pricing correspondence, and his field notes from the first 2 days of work. He laid it all on Graves's desk without preamble and said, "I understand a complaint has been filed that involves my family and my professional work. I'd like to make a statement." Graves heard it. That evening, separately, a letter arrived from the Hawthorne steward, a man named Pruitt, who had worked at the estate for 22 years, and whose reputation for meticulous record-keeping was well established, containing the original note he'd sent to 3 surveyors the week before the summer gathering, inquiring about availability and rates. Thomas Carter's name was one of the 3. The date on the note was 11 days before the gathering. Before Elizabeth had ever set foot in Hawthorne Hall. Before any of it. Elizabeth didn't know about either of these things until Thursday morning, when her father came down to breakfast and set a folded letter on the table next to her plate. She looked at it. "What's this, Magistrate Graves?" he said. "Read it." She read it. The complaint, it said, had been reviewed. In light of the documentation provided by Thomas Carter on Monday afternoon and by the Hawthorne estate steward separately that same evening, the timeline presented by the complainant was inconsistent with the factual record. No further proceedings were warranted. The matter was considered resolved. Elizabeth set the letter down carefully. She did not cry. She was not the crying kind, not from sadness anyway, and this wasn't sadness. This was something more complicated. Relief and anger still married together, and underneath them a particular exhaustion, the kind that comes not from the fight itself, but from the knowledge that the fight should never have been necessary. "It's done," her father said. "Yes," she said. "You were right," he said. "About going Monday. About going alone." She looked at him. "I learned from you," she said. "You always said that when something is true, you don't wait for people to doubt it. You put it in front of them before the doubt has room to grow." Her father looked at her for a moment. "I say that about surveys," he said. "It applies more broadly than surveys," she said. He sat down across from her in his usual chair and picked up his coffee and said quietly to the cup as much as to her, "She was right, your mother, when she said you had good judgment." He paused. "I wasn't always sure. You were too unafraid of things that should have given you more pause. And now," she said. He looked at her. "Now I think unafraid is exactly right," he said, "so long as you're unafraid with good sense underneath it." "Do I have good sense underneath it? You told Hawthorne to go home and send a letter instead of writing to the magistrate with me," he said. "That was the right call. He wanted to come." He paused. "He told me. After." Elizabeth stared at him. "You spoke to him after?" "He was waiting outside Graves's office," her father said. "He didn't come in. He just—" a pause that carried something in it. "He waited until I came out. Then he asked if it had gone all right, and I told him it had, and he said good and rode home." Elizabeth looked at her father and thought about a man who had wanted to come inside and hadn't because she'd told him not to. Who had gone home and sent the letter and then come back anyway and waited outside in the afternoon heat until he knew the outcome and then left without announcing it to anyone. She stood up. "I need to go to Hawthorne Hall," she said. Her father looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected something and was now deciding whether to note the speed of its arrival. "Take the mare," he said. "She's faster." She rode the mare. She had not ridden to Hawthorne Hall before, had walked or been accompanied every other time, and riding felt right. Forward. Her own momentum, her own pace, the road unreeling underneath her with the particular efficiency of a woman who knows where she is going. He was in the East Field, not the house, not the study. The East Field where her father had been working with Caesar at his heels and a pair of field maps in his hand, which meant he had been doing the practical work of a man who owns land and manages it himself, rather than delegating entirely. She pulled up at the field edge, and he looked up and saw her, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then he handed the maps to the man beside him and walked over. "The magistrate closed it," she said. "I know," he said. "Your father told me Thursday." "I know that too," she said. She looked at him from the mare's back, which put her at approximately his eye level. "He told me this morning that you waited." "I wanted to know it had gone well," he said. "You could have asked me, or sent a note." "Yes," he said. "But you went yourself." "I went myself." She looked at him. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you told me to go home," he said. "And you were right to. And what I did after that was for my own reasons, not yours. It wasn't something you needed to manage or account for." "I'm not trying to manage it," she said. "I'm trying to understand it." He looked up at her with the afternoon light behind him and said, "I was worried. I had no right to act on that worry in a way that interfered with what you'd set in motion. So I found the one thing I could do that didn't interfere." He paused. "Waiting is not nothing." She looked at him for a long moment. Something was happening in her chest. Not the startled, complicated feeling of the early weeks, but something quieter and more settled. The feeling of a thing arriving that you had been walking toward for longer than you realized. "No," she said. "It's not nothing." She dismounted. She tied the mare to the fence post and turned to face him properly, on the same level the way she'd always preferred it. "Nathaniel," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. She saw it register on his face, a small thing barely visible but there. He took one breath. "Elizabeth," he said. The name in his voice was different from how anyone else said it. Not softer, he didn't do soft exactly. More deliberate. The way he said things, he had decided to say. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "I have been careful," she said. "These past weeks. I've been careful the way you're careful with something that matters because I didn't want to decide what this was before it showed me. But I think I know now what it is. And I think you know, and I think we're both doing ourselves a disservice by treating it as something that still needs to be determined." He looked at her. "What is it?" "It's this," she said simply. "You, me, the Tuesday visits and the arguments and the way you waited outside the magistrate's office and didn't tell anyone." She held his gaze. "It's the fact that I rode out here today because I needed to see you, and not for any practical reason. Just to see you." The silence that followed was the best silence they had ever had. "Elizabeth," he said. "Don't make a speech," she said. "I don't need one." "I wasn't going to," he said. "I was going to say that I've known what this is since the second Tuesday. I've been careful too because you asked for careful, and because you deserve someone who listens when you ask for things." He paused. "But I've been walking around this farm every Tuesday in my head for 6 weeks." She laughed. It came out before she planned it real unguarded, the laugh she had with her mother in the kitchen, not the social laugh. She heard it and didn't apologize for it. "You've been thinking about our farm, the east corner specifically," he said. And there was the smile, the full one this time, not just the edge of it, and it changed his face entirely. It made him look younger and more human, and considerably less like a man who'd spent 12 years being formidable. "Your father's survey has given me a comprehensive appreciation of your property lines." "That's a very practical man's version of a romantic statement," she said. "I am a practical man," he said. "I know," she said. "I like that about you, among other things." "Among other things," he said. He looked at her with the full, uncalculated attention that she had learned to read as his version of everything that other men put into speeches and gestures. "Will you—" He stopped. Started again without the hesitation this time. "I would like to do this properly. Speak to your father. Speak to you again with more time and fewer field maps in the background." He looked at the maps in the hands of his man 20 yards away, who was very carefully not watching them. "But I want to know first, before I speak to anyone, what you want." She looked at him. "You already know what I want," she said. "I just told you." "I want to hear it plainly." "I want this," she said. "I want you, plainly, without a speech, and without a production, and without anyone arranging it except us." She looked at him with the same steadiness she'd had since the first night, the steadiness that had gotten her through the sitting room, and the village, and the Alderton gathering, and all of it. "I want to choose it, and I am." He reached out, then carefully, deliberately giving her every possible moment to step back from it, and took her hand. Not dramatically, just took it, the way a man takes something he intends to keep. "Then we'll do it properly," he said, and honestly, and slowly enough that you never feel like it was decided for you. "Deal," she said. Caesar chose this moment to abandon the field man entirely and push his large head between them with the proprietary confidence of an animal who had started this and wanted it acknowledged. "Caesar," Nathaniel said. The dog thumped his tail. Elizabeth looked down at him and then back up at Nathaniel Hawthorne, this man who had stood in a doorway and recalculated everything, who had ridden to her gate and unlatched it from the outside, who had gone to a village before she did and not said a word, who had waited outside a magistrate's office in the afternoon heat, because waiting was not nothing. "He really does have good judgment," she said. "The best I've ever known," Nathaniel said, and he was not looking at the dog. He spoke to her father on Saturday. Elizabeth knew it was happening. Nathaniel had told her it would, and he was a man who did what he said he would do, in the order. He said he would do it, but knowing didn't make it easier to be in the kitchen. Rolling pastry dough, she didn't need listening to the low register of two men talking in the front room with the door almost closed. Her mother sat at the kitchen table shelling beans and not commenting, which was its own form of commentary. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Elizabeth had rolled the pastry thin enough to read through before it was half over. She rolled it back into a ball and started again. When the front room went quiet and she heard her father's chair push back, she made herself keep her hands on the dough. She heard the chair. She heard footsteps. She heard the front door open and close, and then her father's step coming toward the kitchen slower than usual, the step of a man carrying something in his chest and not yet sure where to put it. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked at him. "Well," he said. "Papa," he asked properly, her father said. No hedging, no conditions. Said he understood if the family needed time, and that he'd wait however long was needed. A pause. "I told him we didn't need time." Her mother's hand stilled on the beans. "Just for a second." "I told him." Her father continued, looking at Elizabeth with the careful face he wore when he was feeling something too large for his usual economy of expression. That Elizabeth was the one who needed to be asked, and that her yes was worth more than mine, and that if he had that, he had everything that mattered. Elizabeth set down the rolling pin. He said, her father finished, that he knew that, and that he already had it. He looked at her steadily. "Do I need to ask whether that's true?" "No," she said. "You don't." Thomas Carter nodded once the way he nodded at surveys that came out correctly, complete, accounted for. Then he walked back to his chair without further ceremony, because he was her father, and that was how he was, and she loved him so entirely in that moment that she had to look at the wall for a few seconds. Her mother picked up the beans again. "You've overworked that pastry," she said. "I know," Elizabeth said. "Make biscuits instead." She made biscuits. Her hands were shaking slightly, which she noted with the detached interest of someone observing weather. Not fear. Something else, the particular trembling of a person standing at the edge of their own life, looking at how far it has come, and how far it has yet to go, and finding both distances larger than expected. Nathaniel came back in the late afternoon. He knocked, and she answered the door herself this time, and he stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, in the exact configuration as the first Tuesday, except that everything was different now. "Your father said yes," he said. "I know," she said. He told me that your yes was the one that mattered. He told me he told you that." A beat. "And..." She looked at him. "Come inside, Nathaniel," she said. "I made biscuits." He came inside. He ate the biscuits. He sat across from her at the worn table with the candle mark in the corner, and he said more quietly than he usually said anything, "I want to do this right by you. I know what the county expects, and I know what the paperwork requires, and I know what my mother is already planning, and I need you to tell me what you need from all of that." "What I need," she said, "is to mean what I say when I say it, in front of whoever is there to hear it. That's all. That's everything," she said. He looked at her. "Then that's what you'll have." "And Nathaniel?" "Yes." "Your mother," she said. "She's going to want to plan a great deal." The corner of his mouth moved. "She's already made lists." "I know," Elizabeth said. "I could feel it from the Carter farm." She paused. "Let her plan what doesn't matter to me. I'll hold the line on what does. That way we spend less time fighting her and more time on everything else." "You've already decided what you'll hold the line on," he said. It wasn't a question. "I've been thinking about it since Thursday," she said. "Of course you have," he said, and the smile came all the way now full and real. The smile she had been collecting in small increments since a doorway in the summer. "Tell me." Margaret Hawthorne received the news with the composure of a woman who had expected it, and the warmth of a woman who had, over the course of the preceding weeks, revised her initial assessment of Elizabeth Carter so substantially that she would not have recognized the revision as such. She had planned things. Elizabeth had known she would. The guest list, the date, the arrangements that turned a legal and personal occasion into a county event, Margaret had the whole architecture of it ready before Nathaniel finished telling her. Elizabeth sat in the Hawthorne morning room, the same chair as the first time she noted, which felt like something, and listened to the plans and said yes to the things she meant yes to, and for the things she didn't, she said, "I'd like to do it differently," and explained how, and did not apologize for the explanation. Margaret, to her considerable credit, argued only twice, and lost both arguments with something that looked, if you knew how to read her, like respect. "You're going to be difficult," Margaret said after the second one. "Yes," Elizabeth said. "I am. I believe you knew that." "I did," Margaret said. "I've decided it's an asset." "I've always thought so," Elizabeth said. Something genuine moved across the older woman's face. "My son," she said, "has been alone in a particular way for a long time. Not without company. Without someone who made him feel that being himself was sufficient." She paused, and this was not a managed pause. This was real. "I want you to know that I see what you've done for him these past weeks. I want you to know I'm grateful." Elizabeth looked at her steadily. "He's done the same for me," she said. "That's what it should be." "Yes," Margaret said very quietly. "It should." They sat in the morning room for another hour and finished the plans, and when Elizabeth stood to leave, Margaret walked her to the door herself, rather than calling the housekeeper, which was a small thing that said a large thing, and both of them knew it. The wedding was in October. Not a county production, though Margaret had done her best. Elizabeth had held the lines she'd promised herself she'd hold small, real, the people who mattered, rather than the people who expected to be included. And the result was something that felt on the day like themselves, rather than a performance of themselves, which was the only thing Elizabeth had ever wanted a wedding to be. Lucy Marsh was there. The Aldertons were there. Her father stood beside her with his large, careful hands and his best coat, and the expression he wore when something came out exactly right. Her mother sat in the front and did not cry, which was how Elizabeth knew she was moved, because Sarah Carter held the things that mattered too tightly for tears. Reverend Whitmore said the words. Elizabeth said hers, looking directly at Nathaniel, which was apparently not what women did, and she did it anyway because she had said from the beginning that she would mean what she said, and meaning something required looking at the thing you meant it toward. Nathaniel said his the same way, looking at her. No ornamentation, just the words and the intention behind them, and the man behind the intention. Caesar sat outside the church door. Nobody had planned this. He had simply followed the carriage from Hawthorne Hall and stationed himself there with the satisfied authority of an animal who understood the occasion and his own role in it. Several guests commented on this. Elizabeth found it entirely appropriate. Afterward, in the brief private moment that weddings sometimes allow, if you know how to find one, Nathaniel took her hand and said, "You're sure?" She looked at him. "Nathaniel, I need to hear it." "I'm sure," she said. "I have been since Tuesday afternoon in the East Field. You know that." "I know," he said. You wanted to hear it." "Yes." "Then listen carefully," she said, "because I intend to say it only in the contexts where I mean it, and I mean it now completely without reservation, with full awareness of what I'm choosing." She held his gaze. "I'm sure. I choose this. I choose you." He held her hand and didn't say anything, and his face did the thing it did when he was feeling something too large for his usual economy, and she let him have the moment because he had earned it. "Good," he said finally. "That's all you have to say. You told me not to make speeches." She laughed. The same real laugh as the East Field, as the kitchen, as all the moments that had been building to this one. "Fair," she said. What nobody warned her about, and what she discovered in the first months of marriage, was that living with Nathaniel Hawthorne was considerably easier than she had been prepared to find it. She had expected adjustment. She had expected the friction of two independent people occupying the same space and finding its edges. She had not expected the particular ease of a man who genuinely listened, who changed his mind when given good reason, and who had apparently decided that the version of himself she had first encountered, controlled, contained, slightly armored against the world, was not the version he intended to carry through the rest of his life. He was still all those things some of the time. He was also with increasing frequency the man who came in from the fields in the late afternoon and found her in the study, reading one of his books, and sat down across from her without a word, and read his own, and seemed to find this as satisfying as anything else in the day. He was the man who told her 6 weeks into their marriage that he had been wrong about something. Not an apology, she had not asked for one. He had just said over breakfast, "I was wrong about the tenant situation on the north boundary. Your idea was better," and then returned to his coffee. She had looked at him across the table and thought that this more than any grand gesture was the thing she had been looking for, without knowing she was looking for it. He was the man who asked her opinion before making decisions, not as a courtesy, not because it was expected, but because he had determined that she thought about things in ways he didn't, and that her thinking made his better, and he was practical enough to use every good tool available to him. She was not easy. She had told him she wouldn't be, and she was not. She argued. She held positions. She changed her mind when she was wrong, and expected the same from him, and when he didn't change it fast enough, she told him so directly, and waited him out. She had opinions about the estate, about the tenants, about the way the mill lease was structured, and the way the schoolhouse was funded, and the way the county managed the road repair, and she expressed them, and some of them he implemented, and some of them he didn't, and either way, he told her why. They were, as her mother had predicted, both the best thing and the most complicated thing, and they were, as Elizabeth had predicted, both at once. It was in the spring of the following year that the schoolhouse question arrived, not as a question exactly, more as a problem delivered by Reverend Whitmore on a Tuesday afternoon. Whitmore arriving unannounced, which he had always done, and which Elizabeth had never found less appropriate than she did now, with the announcement that the county schoolhouse fund, which had been managed by the church for the past decade, had been mishandled. Not maliciously. Ineptly. The result was a deficit that meant the schoolhouse that served the children of 3 farming families on the South Road would need to close before the summer. Whitmore delivered this information to Nathaniel because Nathaniel was the head of the household, and that was how things were done, and Nathaniel listened and then said, "You should speak to my wife. This is her area." Whitmore looked at him. I beg your pardon." "Elizabeth manages the estate's charitable accounts," Nathaniel said. "And she has been discussing the schoolhouse for 6 months. She knows the situation better than I do." Whitmore turned to Elizabeth with the expression of a man recalibrating which she had begun to think of as a fairly universal response to her existence. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said. "Reverend," she said. "Tell me the number." He told her. She looked at it. She had the charitable accounts in her head. She always had things she was managing in her head, layered and cross-referenced a habit she'd had since childhood, and she moved figures around against each other for 30 seconds, while Whitmore watched her with visible uncertainty. "We can cover the deficit," she said, "on 2 conditions." "Conditions?" Whitmore said. "The first is that the fund management is restructured, not by the church alone. A committee 3 members, one of whom is a woman, because the school primarily serves children, and their mothers are the ones who understand what those children need." Whitmore's mouth opened. "Second condition," she continued. "The school stays open through summer. These children's families are farming families. Losing the school during the growing season when parents are in the fields is the worst possible timing." She looked at him steadily. "If both conditions are acceptable, the Hawthorne estate covers the deficit. If either condition is not acceptable, I'll contact the other large landholders in the county individually and assemble the funds another way. It will take longer, and it will accomplish the same thing, and the conversation about how the church managed the fund in the first place will be more public than anyone needs it to be." Whitmore stared at her. Nathaniel was looking at a point on the far wall with the studied neutrality of a man who was not going to say anything because nothing he could add would improve on what had just been said. Mrs. Hawthorne, Whitmore said after a moment that had considerable content. Reverend. You are very direct. People keep noticing, she said. He left with both conditions accepted. He did not look particularly happy about it. Elizabeth thought he would get there eventually, or he wouldn't, and either way, the school would stay open and the fund would be properly managed, and that was the thing that mattered. After he was gone, Nathaniel looked at her. You had the figures ready, he said. I've been thinking about the schoolhouse since October, she said. I knew the fund was undercapitalized. I was waiting for it to become a problem I could solve rather than a problem I could only worry about. He looked at her with an expression she had seen before in the East Field in the morning room across 100 ordinary moments of the past months. The expression of a man who is looking at something and understanding it more fully than he did before, and finding the fuller understanding better than the partial one. You know, he said, when I was riding home from the magistrate's office the night your father filed his statement, I thought about what you'd said, about the difference between being watched and being seen. I remember saying it. I thought I understood it then, he said. I understand it better now. He paused. I see you, Elizabeth. All of it. The figures in your head, and the conditions you won't apologize for, and the way you protected your father, and walked into that village, and handled every single thing this past year. He held her gaze. I see all of it, and I need you to know that. She looked at him. This man she had found through a hurt dog and a wrong room, and the stubbornness to say true things in difficult places, and she thought about everything that had happened between the summer gathering and this moment, all the small choices and the large ones, all the things they had each done, and not done, and said, and not said, all of it braided together into this life they had built on the foundation of starting with what was true. I know you do, she said. That's why I'm still here. Is it the only reason? He said, and the smile was there, the full one, her favorite one, the one that had taken her months to earn, and that she would, she suspected, spend the rest of her life being glad she'd stayed around to see. No, she said. But it's the first one. Everything else came after. So, the schoolhouse committee was established in April. Elizabeth served on it. The other members were a farmer named Dawes, whose wife had died young, and who raised his 3 daughters with a thoroughness that Elizabeth respected, and a woman named Martha Cole, who had taught reading in her front room for a decade, and knew more about what the South Road children needed than any committee had ever thought to ask her. They met on the first Monday of every month. They were eventually, if not universally approved of, at minimum universally accepted, because the school stayed open, and the children learned, and those were facts that resisted argument. Elizabeth brought Caesar to the first meeting because he had followed her that morning, and she hadn't had the heart to send him back. He sat under the table, and Martha Cole fed him bread from her pocket, and he thumped his tail, and no one said anything about it, because by now the county had largely absorbed the fact that Elizabeth Hawthorne arrived on her own terms, and her dog was part of those terms. Nathaniel came to pick her up after because he had been riding in that direction anyway, and it was not far out of his way, and this was a thing he said, and they both understood it as something else. He pulled up at the schoolhouse door, and she came out, and he leaned down from the saddle and said, "How did it go?" Well, she said. Martha has ideas about the reading curriculum that are excellent, and Dawes knows more about the children's practical needs than I expected, and Caesar ate someone's bread. I see, he said. He looked at her in the afternoon light, this woman who had refused an arranged engagement in his own sitting room, who had walked to the village alone, who had told his mother that her apology was accepted but not forgotten, who had listed conditions to a reverend and meant all of them. He looked at her the way he had looked at her since the East Field, with the full, uncalculated attention that was his version of everything. "Are you ready?" "Yes," she said. She mounted the mare, who had been standing patiently, and they rode back toward Hawthorne Hall together with Caesar between them doing his proprietary trot. And the road was warm, and the afternoon was long, and the fields on either side were her husband's, and the school behind them was better than it had been that morning. The county had not entirely changed. There were still drawing rooms where Elizabeth Hawthorne's name was said with an edge. There were still women who measured other women by their origin rather than their character, and men who found her conditions excessive and her directness inconvenient. The world was what it was. She had not expected to fix it. She had expected only to live in it on terms she could stand behind, and she was doing that. She was doing that every single day. It was 2 years later that a child asked the question. A boy from the South Road School, 8 years old, serious-faced, with the kind of directness that exists in children before the world teaches them it's inconvenient. His name was George Dawes, and he was the middle daughter of the widower Dawes, which was how Elizabeth had always thought of him, though she never said so, because Dawes himself would not have found it amusing. George had taken to following Caesar around the schoolhouse yard on committee Mondays with the devotion of a child who wants a dog and doesn't yet have one, and Caesar tolerated this with dignity. On this particular Monday, George looked up at Nathaniel, who had arrived to collect Elizabeth, and was standing near the fence, letting the children examine his horse, and said with the perfect, uncalculated directness of someone who has been wondering something, and has simply run out of patience for not asking it, "Sir, why did you marry Mrs. Hawthorne?" The schoolyard went very slightly quieter. Martha Cole nearby covered a smile with her hand. Elizabeth, standing 10 feet away, did not pretend she hadn't heard. Nathaniel looked down at the boy. He was quiet for a moment. Not the calculating quiet, not the managing quiet, but the quiet of a man who has been asked a true question and is going to give it a true answer. Because she was the first person, he said, who never wanted my name. George thought about this. What did she want? Nathaniel looked over the boy's head to where Elizabeth was standing, and he held her gaze across the yard with the same steadiness as a doorway and a gate and an east field, and all the distances they had crossed to reach each other. "She wanted my heart," he said, "and she earned it." George appeared to find this a satisfactory answer because he returned to Caesar without further questions. Martha Cole stopped covering her smile. Elizabeth looked at her husband across the yard and thought about a hurt dog in the dark, and a room she had entered by accident, and a life she had chosen on purpose. And she thought clearly without the locked-away qualifier, without any of the careful reservations that had served their purpose, and were no longer needed, that she would follow that dog into that dark 100 times. She would choose every single thing that had come after. She crossed the yard toward him. He met her halfway, because that was how they had always done it, neither waiting for the other to cover the whole distance, neither requiring the other to come all the way. "Ready?" he said. "I've been ready," she said, "since Tuesday afternoon in the East Field." He smiled her favorite smile, the full one. The one she had carried in small increments since a doorway in summer and would carry for the rest of her life, and he offered her his hand. She took it. Because she chose to. Because it was hers. Because some things start with a hurt animal in the dark and end up being the truest thing you've ever walked toward and the only thing required of you. The only thing that was ever required was the willingness to follow where it led and to mean what you said when you arrived. And Elizabeth Carter Hawthorne had always, in every room and every difficulty and every moment that mattered, meant exactly what she said. That in the end was everything.